At 63 years old, Evelyn Hart had $17, a carpet bag with a broken handle, and absolutely nowhere left to go. The stagecoach that brought her to Redstone, Arizona had already vanished into the desert dust, carrying away her last chance to turn back. Her sister, the woman who'd promised her a home, was 3 days dead and buried. Standing alone in the territorial heat with the sun burning her shoulders and strangers staring from shadowed doorways, Evelyn realized the truth that makes a person's knees go weak. She had finally reached the end of every road she'd ever known. If you're watching from somewhere in this big world, drop a comment with your city below. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Hit that like button and stick with me until the end, because what happens next will remind you that sometimes life saves its most unexpected gifts for when we think we've run completely out of chances. The Arizona sun felt different than the Indiana sun Evelyn had known for 6 decades. Harsher, more honest. It didn't apologize for burning, didn't soften itself for delicate sensibilities or Sunday manners. It simply was, relentless and indifferent, much like the truth she now faced standing in the middle of Redstone's main street with dust settling on her black mourning dress. She'd been wearing black for 2 years. First for Thomas, her husband of 37 years, dead from pneumonia that had filled his lungs like water in a drowning man. Then for the life they'd built together. The house sold to pay debt she hadn't known existed, the furniture auctioned to strangers, the garden she'd tended for 3 decades plowed under by the new owner before she'd even finished packing her things. And now, though she hadn't put on fresh mourning clothes for it, she wore black for her sister Margaret too. "You're sure?" Evelyn heard herself ask the livery owner again, though she'd already asked twice. "Margaret Hart? Died 3 days ago?" The man, weathered and lean like jerky left too long in the smoke, nodded with the patience of someone who'd delivered bad news before and knew it took several tellings to sink in. "Margaret Brennan, ma'am. Took her maiden name back after her husband passed, but yeah, same woman. The fever that went through here last month took 11 souls. She was one of them." Evelyn's fingers tightened on the handle of her carpet bag. The leather was cracked and warm from the journey, worn smooth by her grip during the long ride from the train station in Tucson. "She wrote me in June. She said I could come stay with her. She said she had room." "I'm sure she did, ma'am." Margaret was kind-hearted, but wanting something and living to see it through are different matters. He gestured vaguely toward the north end of town. "She's buried up at the cemetery. Had a nice service. Reverend spoke well of her." The words washed over Evelyn like water over stone, acknowledged but not absorbed. She stood there in the middle of the street, aware that people were watching from the mercantile, from the saloon across the way, from the boarding house with its painted sign swinging in the hot breeze, watching the way people watch a wagon with a broken wheel or a horse gone lame, with curiosity and pity and the quiet relief that it wasn't happening to them. "Is there family?" the liveryman asked, his voice gentling. "Someone I can send word to for you?" Evelyn shook her head. Margaret had been the last. Thomas's people had never taken to her, and her own family had scattered or died over the years, until there was only Margaret left, 5 years older and perpetually disappointed in Evelyn's choices. They hadn't been close, not in decades. But when Thomas died and the debts came due and the house went to auction, Margaret's letter had arrived like an answered prayer Evelyn hadn't even known how to speak. "Come to Arizona," Margaret had written in her cramped, practical hand. "The heat is ungodly and the dust gets into everything, but there's space here. Room enough for 2 sisters to finish out their days without being a burden to anyone." It hadn't been a warm invitation. Margaret didn't do warm, but it had been an offer, and Evelyn had sold everything she had left to scrape together the train fare west and the stagecoach ticket south, arriving with $17 and the clothes in her bag and nothing else in the world. "There's a boarding house," the liveryman offered. "Mrs. Chen runs it. Clean rooms, fair prices." Evelyn had already done the arithmetic in her head during the long, jostling ride from Tucson. The boarding house would take most of her remaining money within a week. 2 weeks if she skipped meals. And then what? She was 63 years old, with no skills anyone would pay for, no references, no family. She'd been Thomas's wife, and that had been her occupation, managing his house, tending his comfort, bearing the children who'd come too early and left too soon, one after another until the doctor had said her body wouldn't carry another. She'd been good at being Thomas's wife. She'd made that life work for 37 years. But Thomas was gone, and that life had ended with him, and she had no earthly idea how to begin another one. "Ma'am?" The liveryman's voice pulled her back. "You all right?" "Yes," Evelyn lied, because that's what respectable women did. They said they were fine even when they were breaking apart inside, even when the ground beneath their feet had turned to sand and they were sinking. "Thank you for your help." She picked up her bag and started walking, though she had no destination. Her legs moved because standing still felt like surrender, like lying down in the street and admitting defeat. The boardwalk planks creaked under her feet. The sun hammered down on her black bonnet. Somewhere a dog barked and a child laughed, and life in Redstone continued on exactly as it had before Evelyn Hart arrived to find her last hope already buried in the rocky Arizona ground. She passed the mercantile, where women in faded calico dresses examined bolts of fabric. She passed the saloon, where men's voices rumbled behind swinging doors. She passed a building with a hand-painted sign reading, "Dr. Samuel Walsh, Physician," and another advertising fine dining and spirits. Each building seemed to lean away from her, as if her misfortune might be catching. At the end of the main street, the buildings thinned out. Beyond them lay the desert, vast and empty and burnished gold in the afternoon light. Evelyn kept walking until she reached a water trough at the edge of town, placed there for horses and travelers. She set down her bag and sat on the low stone wall surrounding the trough, grateful to rest her legs and her heart, and the terrible weight of not knowing what came next. The water in the trough was clear, fed by a pipe from somewhere underground. She could see her reflection in it, distorted and wavering, but recognizable. An old woman with gray hair escaping from a practical bun, lines carved deep around her mouth and eyes, skin weathered by 6 decades of living. She'd been pretty once, or so Thomas had told her when they were young. She'd had dark hair and quick hands and a laugh that came easy. That woman was gone now, worn away by time and work and disappointment, leaving behind this tired stranger who didn't know how to be anything except someone's wife or sister, and who'd just lost the last person who might have claimed her. "You planning to jump in or just admire it?" Evelyn startled, nearly losing her balance on the stone wall. She turned to find a man standing a respectful distance away, tall and raw-boned, with silver hair beneath a battered hat and a face that had seen at least as many years as her own. He wore work clothes that had been mended more than once, and his hands, resting on his belt, were the scarred, capable hands of someone who'd spent his life doing hard physical labor. "I'm sorry," Evelyn said automatically, starting to rise. "I didn't mean to trespass." "You're not trespassing. This is town property." His voice was rough, like gravel shifting, but not unkind. "I just noticed you sitting here looking like you were contemplating either baptism or drowning, and I figured I'd check which it was." Despite everything, Evelyn felt a small, startled laugh escape. "Neither, I think." "Good. Both seem like extreme reactions to Redstone, though I'll admit the town can inspire strong feelings." He tilted his head slightly, studying her with eyes that were a faded blue, like denim washed too many times. "You're Margaret Brennan's sister." It wasn't a question, but Evelyn nodded anyway. "Evelyn Hart, though I suppose I should say I was her sister since she's gone." "Caleb Moore." He didn't offer his hand, which Evelyn appreciated. The social niceties felt exhausting in her current state. "I heard you'd arrived. News travels fast in a town this size." "Then you probably also heard that I arrived too late." "I did." Caleb shifted his weight, hooking his thumbs in his belt. "Margaret spoke well of you, said you kept a fine house." Evelyn looked away, back toward the desert. That was a different life. Most lives are, once they're behind us. The words hung in the air between them, simple and true. Evelyn found herself studying him more carefully, the deep lines around his mouth, the way he stood with the slightly stiff posture of someone whose body had been used hard over many years, the silver stubble on his jaw that suggested he shaved when he remembered but didn't much care about it. He looked like a man who'd been weathered by time and circumstance until only the essential parts remained. "Margaret mentioned you," Evelyn said after a moment. "In her letters. She said you had the ranch next to hers." "Still do, though ranch is a generous word for 40 acres and a handful of cattle." Caleb glanced toward the western horizon, where the sun was beginning its descent. Margaret was a good neighbor, kept her property neat, didn't let her fence lines drift. I'm sorry you've lost her. Thank you. The words felt automatic, the kind of thing one said because that's what grief required. Polite acknowledgement, proper gratitude. The performance of sorrow according to acceptable social standards. But standing there at the edge of Redstone with the desert spreading out before her, and nothing but $17 and uncertainty ahead, Evelyn found she didn't have the energy for performance anymore. I don't know what I'm going to do, she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. I came here because I had nowhere else to go, and now she's gone. And I still have nowhere to go, except now I'm here instead of there, which doesn't seem like much of an improvement. She expected him to offer the usual platitudes. Things would work out. God had a plan. She'd find her way. That's what people said when someone else's life fell apart. They offered comfortable lies because the truth was too uncomfortable to speak. But Caleb Moore didn't offer platitudes. He just looked at her with those faded blue eyes and nodded slowly, as if she'd said something that made perfect sense. That's a hard place to be, he said finally. Yes. Evelyn pressed her palms against her skirt, feeling the worn fabric under her fingers. I'm 63 years old. I have no children, no family, no skills anyone would pay for. I was Thomas's wife for 37 years, and I was good at it. But Thomas is dead, and that life is over, and I don't know how to be anything else. She stopped abruptly, shocked by her own honesty. She'd never spoken like this to anyone, not even to Thomas during their marriage, when she'd kept her fears and doubts carefully hidden behind the competent facade of a proper wife. But something about this man's steady presence, his lack of false comfort, made the truth spill out. I'm sorry, she said, heat rising in her cheeks. I don't know why I'm telling you this. Because sometimes the weight gets too heavy to carry alone. Caleb's expression didn't change. And because I'm a stranger, which makes it easier to speak plain. Yes, Evelyn admitted. I suppose that's it. They stood in silence for a moment. A hawk circled overhead, riding the thermal currents. Somewhere in town, a hammer struck an anvil in a steady rhythm. The sun continued its slow descent, painting the clouds in shades of copper and rose. I lost my wife 19 years ago, Caleb said abruptly. Catherine. She was 48. Heart gave out one morning while she was making breakfast. She was laughing at something I'd said, and then she wasn't laughing anymore, and then she was gone. Evelyn looked at him, saw the tightness around his eyes that came from old grief, carefully contained. We had a son, Caleb continued, James. Good boy, smart. He's a lawyer now, up in San Francisco. Has a wife and children I've never met. He writes twice a year, Christmas and my birthday, and the letters are always friendly and distant, like he's writing to an acquaintance he wants to keep at arm's length. I'm sorry, Evelyn said softly. Caleb shrugged. It is what it is. After Catherine died, I buried myself in work, built fences, tended cattle, fixed things that didn't need fixing. James tried to talk to me, tried to keep us connected, but I didn't know how to be a father without Catherine there to show me the way. She was the one who knew how to talk to him, how to understand what he needed. I just knew how to work. He paused, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He left for college when he was 18, and he never came back. Not really. He visits once every few years, stays for a day or two, and then he's gone again, back to his real life. The one that doesn't include me. Evelyn heard the loneliness in his words, recognized it because it matched her own. You must miss him. I miss the idea of him, the boy he was before I failed him. Caleb's mouth twisted in something that wasn't quite a smile. But that boy's been gone as long as Catherine has. What I miss now is just the sound of someone else in the house. The feeling of not being alone. The confession hung between them, raw and honest. Evelyn understood it completely. That ache for simple presence, for the small sounds of another person living nearby. The rustle of movement in another room, the rhythm of someone else's breathing. The knowledge that if you spoke, someone would hear. I've been alone for 2 years, she said, since Thomas died. And it's the silence that's hardest. Not the big things, the important conversations or the shared decisions, just the small, ordinary silence where there used to be another person. Yes, Caleb said, and that single word held more understanding than 1,000 sympathetic speeches. The sun touched the horizon, bleeding red and gold across the sky. Evening shadows stretched long across the dusty ground. Evelyn knew she should get up, find the boarding house, spend some of her precious $17 on a room for the night. Start figuring out what came next, even though she had no idea what that might be. But she didn't move. Neither did Caleb. The thing about being alone, Caleb said slowly, as if working through a thought that had been forming for a long time, is that it makes you realize what you took for granted. Not the grand gestures or the romantic notions, just the comfort of ordinary company. Someone to share a meal with, someone to talk to at the end of the day, someone who knows your name and cares if you wake up in the morning. Evelyn felt something shift in her chest, recognition perhaps, or the faint stirring of possibility. I have a house, Caleb continued, his voice steady and matter-of-fact. 4 rooms, good well, sturdy roof. It's too big for one person, too quiet. I keep it clean and the stove working, but it's a hollow kind of living, going through the motions alone. He turned to look at her directly, and Evelyn saw something in his eyes that wasn't pity or charity or romantic delusion. It was simple, clear-eyed honesty. You need a home, he said. I need someone to share one with. We're both too old for pretense or games, too worn down by life to believe in fairy tales. But we're not too old for companionship, for having someone else at the table, for not spending the rest of our days alone. Evelyn's heart began to beat faster. Mr. Moore, I'm not asking you to love me, Caleb interrupted, his tone remaining calm and practical. I'm not asking for romance or passion or any of the things young people promise each other. I'm asking if you'd consider a partnership, a practical arrangement between 2 people who've lived long enough to know that loneliness is harder than compromise. He paused, then spoke the words that would change everything. Do you need a home, Mrs. Hart? And would you consider taking a husband who comes with it? The question hung in the air between them, stunning in its directness. Evelyn stared at him, her mind reeling. She'd known this man for perhaps 15 minutes. He was a stranger. This was insane. But then again, what was the alternative? The boarding house and her dwindling $17? Looking for work no one would give a 63-year-old widow? Slowly starving in a strange town, too proud to beg but too desperate to survive any other way? And he wasn't offering romance. He wasn't making promises about love or happiness or forever. He was offering something simpler and, in its way, more honest, a practical solution to practical problems. 2 people who'd reached the end of their respective roads, choosing to walk the final stretch together rather than alone. I don't know you, Evelyn heard herself say. No, but you could. Caleb's expression didn't change. We could learn. People used to make marriages on less practical arrangements, partnerships built on need and mutual benefit. Some of them became love matches over time. Others remained friendships, but most of them were better than being alone. I was married for 37 years, Evelyn said, to Thomas. I was a good wife to him. I'm sure you were. I don't know if I can be that again. If I have it in me to build another life with someone new. I'm not asking for the same life you had, Caleb said gently. I'm asking for something different, simpler maybe. 2 people who keep each other company, who sit at the same table and share the same roof and don't have to face the silence alone. Evelyn looked away, toward the desert where the shadows were deepening and the first stars beginning to appear. Her whole life she'd done what was expected, been the dutiful daughter, the proper wife, the respectable widow. She'd followed the rules and met the expectations and maintained the appearances that society demanded. And where had it gotten her? Alone in a strange town with $17 and no prospects, sitting at a water trough while a stranger offered her a marriage of convenience because she'd literally run out of options. I'd want my own space, she said abruptly, surprising herself. A room of my own, at least at first, until we knew each other better. The house has 3 bedrooms, Caleb said. You can have whichever one suits you. And I'd want to contribute to the household. I can cook and clean and mend. I can manage a house and a garden. I won't be a burden. I didn't think you would be. And if it doesn't work, if we find we can't stand each other or we've made a terrible mistake, I'd need to know I could leave, that I wouldn't be trapped. Caleb nodded slowly. I won't hold you against your will, Mrs. Hart. If you decide to go, I'll make sure you have the means to do so. You have my word. Evelyn turned to face him fully, studying his weathered face in the fading light. He looked tired and lonely and honest. A man who'd lived long enough to know his own limitations, who wasn't pretending to offer more than he had to give. Why me? She asked. You could have asked anyone. There must be widows in town who'd— I don't know anyone else, Caleb interrupted. And I'm not looking for just anyone. I'm looking for someone who understands what I'm offering and what I'm not. Someone who's lived enough to know that comfort and companionship matter more than passion. Someone who's tired enough of being alone to take a chance on not being alone anymore. He paused, then added quietly, You look like that person, sitting here by the water. Like someone who'd reached the end of something and didn't know how to begin anything new. I recognized it because I see it in my own mirror every morning. The honesty of it took Evelyn's breath away. No flattery, no false promises, no pretense that this was anything other than what it was. Two lonely people reaching for each other because the alternative was continuing to suffer alone. I need time to think, she said finally. Of course. Caleb tipped his hat slightly. I'm staying at the hotel tonight, room 7, if you want to find me. Otherwise, my ranch is 3 miles north on the main road. White house with green shutters. Can't miss it. He started to turn away, then paused. Mrs. Hart, whatever you decide, I hope you land on your feet. You seem like good people, and good people deserve better than hard landings. Then he walked away, his boots crunching on the gravel, leaving Evelyn alone with the gathering darkness and the most unexpected proposition she'd ever received. She sat there as the stars emerged one by one, as the temperature dropped and the desert night settled in around her. She thought about Thomas, about the life they'd built and lost. She thought about Margaret's empty house and her own dwindling options. She thought about loneliness and practical arrangements and the difference between surviving and living. And she thought about Caleb Moore's faded blue eyes and weathered hands and the simple, devastating truth of his words. We're both too old for pretense, but we're not too old for companionship. When full darkness had fallen and the temperature had dropped enough to make her shiver in her thin dress, Evelyn picked up her carpet bag and walked back into town. She found the hotel easily enough, a 2-story building with a painted sign and lamplight glowing in the windows. The clerk at the desk was young, barely 20, with curious eyes and a friendly smile. Help you, ma'am? Room 7, Evelyn said, her voice steadier than she felt. I need to speak with the gentleman staying there. The clerk's eyebrows rose slightly, but he nodded. I'll send someone up to let him know. Evelyn waited in the small lobby, her hands gripping the handle of her bag, her heart beating so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. She was being foolish, reckless. This was how women ended up ruined, or worse, trusting strange men who made impossible offers in desperate moments. But then again, she was 63 years old, penniless, and alone. How much worse could her situation possibly get? Caleb appeared at the top of the stairs a few minutes later, still wearing the same worn clothes, his expression calm and unsurprised, as if he'd been expecting her. He came down slowly, favoring his left leg slightly, and stopped a respectful distance away. Mrs. Hart. I have conditions, Evelyn said before she could lose her nerve. If I agree to this. All right. I want a simple ceremony. No fuss, no spectacle, just the legal minimum. That suits me fine. I keep my maiden name on my personal belongings. What's mine stays mine. Caleb nodded. Fair enough. And we give it a month, 4 weeks to see if we can stand each other's company. If either of us wants out after that, we shake hands and part ways with no hard feelings and enough money for me to get to the next town. Agreed. Evelyn took a deep breath. And you have to tell me why. The real reason. Not the practical explanation about companionship and empty houses, the real, true reason you'd ask a stranger to marry you based on 15 minutes of conversation. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. When he spoke, his voice was low and sincere. Because I'm 70 years old, and I'm tired of waking up to silence. I'm tired of cooking meals for one, and eating alone and going days without speaking to another soul. I'm tired of being a man my own son can't stand to spend time with, of living in a house that echoes with ghosts. I'm tired of wondering if this is all there is, work and sleep and waiting to die. He met her eyes directly. You asked me an honest question at the water trough. You told me the truth about your situation, and I recognized myself in it. We're two people who've lost everything we built, standing at the edge wondering what comes next. I figured maybe what comes next doesn't have to be nothing. Maybe it could be something small and simple and real, two people keeping each other company through whatever time we have left. He paused, then added softly, and maybe because when I saw you sitting there alone, I thought, there's someone who knows what it costs to keep going when you've lost your reasons to. I respected that. I still do. Evelyn felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back. She'd cried enough in the past 2 years. What she needed now wasn't tears, but courage. When? She asked. Tomorrow, if you're willing. There's a magistrate in town who can do the paperwork. We could be married by noon and at the ranch by evening. That fast? Caleb's mouth quirked in something almost like a smile. Mrs. Hart, we're both old enough to know that waiting doesn't make hard decisions easier. It just gives doubt more time to take root. He was right. If she thought about this too long, if she gave herself time to consider all the ways it could go wrong, she'd lose her nerve entirely. Better to jump and hope for solid ground than to stand on the edge forever, paralyzed by fear. All right, Evelyn said, and felt the words reshape reality around her. Tomorrow at noon. Caleb nodded once, a gesture that felt like a contract being sealed. I'll arrange everything. Do you need a room for tonight? I have $17, Evelyn said. I should probably save it. I'll get you a room. Caleb turned to the clerk before Evelyn could protest. Put Mrs. Hart in room 9. Clean linens and send up a dinner tray if she wants one. Bill it to my account. Mister? More, I can't. You can and you will, Caleb said, his tone gentle but firm. We're getting married tomorrow. That means what's mine is yours, starting now. No sense in false pride between partners. Partners. The word settled into Evelyn's chest, strange and foreign, and somehow comforting. She'd been Thomas's wife, Margaret's sister, her mother's daughter. But she'd never been anyone's partner, not in the true sense of the word, with all its implications of equality and mutual benefit. Thank you, she said quietly. Caleb tipped his hat. Get some rest, Mrs. Hart. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. He turned and climbed the stairs back to his own room, leaving Evelyn standing in the lobby with the clerk staring at her with barely concealed curiosity. Room 9 is at the end of the hall, the clerk said, handing her a key. Up the stairs and to the left. I'll bring up a dinner tray in about 20 minutes. Anything particular you'd like? Whatever's easy, Evelyn said. I'm not particular. She climbed the stairs slowly, feeling every one of her 63 years in her knees and back. The hallway was narrow and dim, lit by oil lamps set in brackets on the walls. Room 9 was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking the main street. Evelyn set down her carpet bag and sank onto the bed, suddenly exhausted beyond measure. This morning she'd woken up on a stagecoach, hopeful and anxious about reuniting with Margaret. Tonight she was preparing to marry a stranger and move to a ranch she'd never seen. The sheer insanity of it should have terrified her. Instead, she felt a strange, quiet calm settling over her. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was resignation. Or maybe it was simply the relief of having made a decision, any decision, after months of being carried along by circumstance with no control over her own fate. A knock at the door announced the dinner tray, beef stew and bread, simple but hot and plentiful. Evelyn ate slowly, savoring each bite, trying not to think about what tomorrow would bring. But as she lay in bed later, listening to the sounds of the town settling into sleep, she found herself thinking about Caleb Moore's words. We're not too old for companionship. She hoped he was right, because tomorrow she was going to bet the last of her courage and her $17 on it. The morning light came harsh through the window, waking Evelyn before she was ready. She'd slept poorly, drifting in and out of dreams where Thomas was still alive, and Margaret was waiting at a house that kept shifting and changing until Evelyn couldn't find the door. Now, sitting up in the unfamiliar bed with her back aching and her mouth dry, she had to piece together where she was and why. Redstone. The hotel. Caleb Moore's proposal. Her wedding day. The thought sent a jolt through her system that was equal parts terror and something she couldn't quite name. Not excitement, she was too old and too practical for that, but perhaps a kind of grim determination, the feeling of a woman who'd made a decision and would see it through regardless of consequences. She washed at the basin, using the lukewarm water and the sliver of soap provided by the hotel. Her hand shook slightly as she unpinned her hair and combed it out, working through the tangles with the patience of long practice. Gray threaded through what had once been dark brown, and there were more lines around her eyes than she remembered. When had that happened? When had she become this old woman staring back from the mirror? The knock at her door came at 8 o'clock, accompanied by a woman's voice. "Mrs. Hart, I'm Clara Chen from the boarding house. Mr. Moore asked if I might help you prepare." Evelyn opened the door to find a Chinese woman, perhaps 10 years younger than herself, dressed in a practical gray dress with her hair in a neat bun. Her face was kind but unsentimental, with the look of someone who'd seen enough of life to have run out of judgment. "I don't need much help," Evelyn said. "I'm not preparing for anything grand. Even simple occasions deserve proper attention." Clara stepped into the room without waiting for invitation, carrying a small basket. "Mr. Moore said you arrived yesterday with only a traveling bag. I thought you might appreciate a few things." She set the basket on the bed and began unpacking. A bar of lavender soap, a small bottle of rose water, hairpins, and a pressed handkerchief with delicate embroidery along the edge. "I can't pay for these," Evelyn said quietly. "They're not for sale. They're gifts." Clara's hands moved efficiently, arranging the items. "Redstone is a small town, Mrs. Hart. We take care of our own, and as of this afternoon, you'll be one of us." The simple kindness of it made Evelyn's throat tight. "Thank you." Clara nodded, then pulled out one more item, a dress in deep blue cotton, simple but well made, with a high collar and long sleeves. "You can't get married in traveling clothes or mourning black. This belonged to my daughter before she married and moved to Tucson. She won't mind the loan." Evelyn touched the fabric, feeling the quality of the weave. "It's too fine." "It's practical, which is what you need." Clara's expression softened slightly. "I knew your sister, Mrs. Hart. Margaret was a good woman, if a stern one. She would have wanted you to have a proper start here, even if the circumstances are unusual." Evelyn felt tears threaten and pushed them back. "Did she ever mention me, in the months before she died?" "She did. She said you'd lived a hard life and deserved better than you'd gotten. She said she hoped Arizona might give you a fresh beginning." Clara paused, her eyes studying Evelyn's face. "I think she'd approve of what you're doing. Caleb Moore is a good man, quiet and stubborn, but good." "You know him?" "Everyone knows everyone here. Caleb's been ranching north of town for near 30 years, lost his wife long ago, and his son moved away. He keeps to himself mostly, but he's fair in his dealings and he doesn't make promises he can't keep." Clara began helping Evelyn with her hair, gentle but efficient. "What he's offering you isn't romance, I expect." "No," Evelyn said. "It's not." "That might be better, at your age. Romance burns hot and fast and leaves you cold when it goes out. Companionship lasts longer if you're both willing to work at it." The words settled into Evelyn's mind as Clara worked, pinning her hair in a style that was simple but neat, making her look less like a desperate widow and more like a woman preparing for an important occasion. When Clara held up the small mirror so Evelyn could see, she barely recognized herself. "There," Clara said with satisfaction. "Now you look like someone beginning something, not someone ending it." Evelyn changed into the blue dress while Clara discreetly turned away. And when she looked at herself again, she saw someone different. Not young, there was no disguising her age, but dignified, purposeful. A woman making a choice rather than a victim being carried along by circumstance. "The magistrate's office is at 10, Clara said, gathering her basket. "Caleb will meet you there. It's the white building next to the livery. You can't miss it." "Will you be there?" Evelyn asked, surprised by how much she wanted the answer to be yes. Clara smiled. "Someone needs to witness, don't they? I'll bring my husband. He's good at standing quiet and signing papers." After Clara left, Evelyn sat on the bed for a long time, staring at her hands. These hands had kneaded bread and scrubbed floors and tended sick children who didn't survive and nursed a husband through his final illness. They were old hands now, spotted with age and roughened by work. In a few hours, they would sign papers that would change her name and her circumstances and the entire shape of her remaining life. She thought about Thomas, about the life they'd built together. He'd been a good husband in his way. He'd provided for her, been faithful as far as she knew, treated her with a distant kind of respect. But they'd never been partners. Not really. He'd made the decisions and she'd implemented them. He'd earned the money and she'd managed the household. They'd existed in parallel rather than together, two people sharing space but rarely truly connecting. Would it be different with Caleb? Or would she simply be trading one form of loneliness for another, the silence of an empty house for the silence of two people who had nothing to say to each other? The clock on the wall ticked toward 10. Evelyn stood, smoothed her borrowed dress, picked up her small bag of belongings, and walked downstairs. The morning air was already warm, promising another scorching day. She walked to the magistrate's office with her head up and her steps measured, aware of people watching from doorways and windows. News had traveled, as it always did in small towns. The stranger who'd come for her dead sister was marrying Caleb Moore. They'd be talking about it for weeks. Let them talk. She'd spent her whole life worried about what people thought, and where had it gotten her. The magistrate's office was small and spare, with a desk, a few chairs, and an American flag in the corner. Caleb was already there, wearing what looked like his best clothes, a dark jacket over a clean white shirt, his silver hair combed back, his boots polished. He stood when she entered, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Hart." "Mr. Moore." They looked at each other for a long moment. In the daylight, Evelyn could see the deep lines around his eyes, the way his shoulders curved slightly forward as if he'd spent years bracing against weight. He was a man who'd lived hard and carried loss, and it showed in every line of his weathered face. Clara arrived moments later with a short, stocky Chinese man she introduced as her husband, William. He nodded politely but said nothing, content to let his wife do the talking. The magistrate was a thin man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers who looked at them both with mild curiosity but no judgment. "You're both of legal age and sound mind?" "Yes," they answered in unison. "Any legal impediments to this marriage?" "No." He produced papers, explained the legal requirements in a dry monotone, and had them both sign in the appropriate places. Clara and William signed as witnesses. The whole process took perhaps 15 minutes, efficient and emotionless, nothing like the ceremony Evelyn had experienced with Thomas all those years ago, with its flowers and promises and hopeful futures. "By the authority vested in me by the territory of Arizona, I pronounce you husband and wife," the magistrate said, signing his own name with a flourish. "You may kiss if you'd like, though it's not required." Caleb looked at Evelyn. She looked back. Neither of them moved. "We'll save that for later," Caleb said finally, and Evelyn felt a small, unexpected surge of gratitude for his tact. They paid the fee. Caleb handled it before Evelyn could even reach for her small collection of bills, and stepped back out into the bright Arizona morning as husband and wife. Evelyn's hand trembled slightly as she tucked the marriage certificate into her bag. It was done. She was Mrs. Caleb Moore now, tied to a man she barely knew, about to go live in a house she'd never seen. "I have a wagon," Caleb said. "We can head to the ranch whenever you're ready." "I'm ready now." There was no point in delaying. The longer she waited, the more time she'd have to second-guess herself. Caleb's wagon was old but well-maintained, pulled by two sturdy horses that looked like they'd seen as many years as their owner. He helped Evelyn up to the seat with a gentleman's automatic courtesy, then climbed up beside her and took the reins. "It's about 3 miles," he said as they pulled away from town. "Road's rough in places." Evelyn nodded, gripping the edge of the seat as the wagon jolted over ruts and rocks. The town fell away behind them, replaced by open desert dotted with scrub brush and the occasional twisted tree. Mountains rose in the distance, purple and hazy in the heat. The sky was so blue it hurt to look at, and the sun beat down with relentless intensity. They rode in silence for a while, the only sounds the creak of the wagon, the horses' steady plodding, and the occasional cry of a bird overhead. Evelyn studied the landscape, trying to imagine living here, building a life in this harsh, beautiful emptiness. "You'll need a hat," Caleb said abruptly. "The sun here will burn you fierce if you're not careful." "I have a bonnet." "That's not enough. I'll get you a proper hat in town next time we go." You don't need to. Yes, I do. His voice was firm but not unkind. We're married now, Mrs. Hart. That means I look after you. It's not charity, it's obligation. Evelyn felt something shift in her chest. Obligation. It wasn't a romantic word, but it was honest. And honesty, she was learning, had its own kind of comfort. Evelyn, she said. He glanced at her. Ma'am? My name is Evelyn. If we're married, you should use it. The corner of his mouth twitched in what might have been the start of a smile. All right. Evelyn. And you can call me Caleb, seeing as Mr. Moore sounds like you're talking to my father. Caleb? She repeated, testing the shape of it in her mouth. They fell back into silence, but it felt different now. Less strained, more companionable. The wagon rolled on, carrying them north across the desert toward whatever waited at the end of the road. The ranch appeared gradually, first as a distant shape shimmering in the heat, then resolving into a white house with green shutters just as Caleb had described. It sat in a small valley with low hills rising behind it, and Evelyn could see the fenced pastures where a handful of cattle grazed. A windmill turned slowly in the breeze, and there was a barn that looked like it had been recently repaired, its wood still fresh and golden. It's not much, Caleb said as they drew closer, but the house is sound, and the well's good, and the land produces enough to keep body and soul together. Evelyn thought it looked like paradise compared to the water trough where she'd sat yesterday contemplating her complete lack of options. It looks fine. He pulled the wagon up to the house and climbed down, then reached up to help her. His hands were calloused and warm, and he steadied her carefully as she stepped down, her legs stiff from the ride. The house was smaller up close than it had looked from a distance, a simple wooden structure with a covered porch and windows that needed washing. Caleb opened the door and stepped back to let her enter first. Inside it was dim and cooler, a relief after the brutal sun. Evelyn's eyes adjusted slowly, taking in the main room that served as both kitchen and living space. There was a cast iron stove, a table with 2 chairs, a worn armchair near the fireplace, and shelves lined with dishes and supplies. Everything was clean but spare, the home of a man who kept things functional but saw no point in decoration. Kitchen's here, Caleb said, gesturing around them. Bedroom's through there. That was mine and Catherine's. There's 2 more rooms down the hall. You can have whichever one you want. Evelyn walked down the short hallway, looking into each room. One was clearly being used for storage, filled with boxes and tools and items that had no other home. The other was empty except for a narrow bed and a chest of drawers, with a window looking out toward the hills. This one, she said. Caleb nodded. I'll bring in some more furniture. There's a wardrobe in the barn I can move in, and another chair. I don't need much. Nevertheless. He set her bag down on the bed. I'll leave you to settle in. Take your time looking around, getting your bearings. I've got work to do in the barn, but I'll be back around noon to fix some lunch. He left her alone, his boots heavy on the wooden floor, and Evelyn heard the front door close behind him. She stood in the small room that was now hers, looking at the bare walls and the simple bed and the window with its view of endless sky, and wondered what on earth she'd done. But there was no point in wondering. It was done. She was here. This was her life now. She unpacked her carpet bag with methodical precision, hanging her few dresses in the empty chest of drawers, arranging her hairbrush and the small tin of tooth powder on top of the dresser. She had so little, the physical evidence of 63 years of living fit into a single bag with room to spare. It should have been depressing, but instead Evelyn felt a strange lightness. She'd shed so much weight along with her possessions. All the things she'd thought were important, all the furniture and silver and linens that had seemed to define her worth as Thomas's wife. All of it gone, and she was still here, still breathing, still capable of beginning again. She explored the house slowly, opening cupboards and drawers with the careful courtesy of someone entering another person's space. The kitchen was well stocked with basics: flour, coffee, salt, dried beans, canned goods. The dishes were mismatched but functional. There was a tin of biscuits that had gone stale and a half-empty jar of jam that looked months old. A man living alone, making do. Evelyn found a rag and began dusting, not because Caleb had asked her to, but because it gave her hands something to do. She wiped down the table and the shelves, washed the dishes that had been left in the basin, swept the floor. The work was familiar, comforting in its routine. This she knew how to do. This she was good at. She was washing the windows when Caleb returned, his shirt dusty and his face showing the strain of physical labor. "You don't have to do that," he said, stopping in the doorway. "I know." Evelyn wrung out the rag. "But I wanted to." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I appreciate it. Place looks better already." They made lunch together, or rather, Evelyn made it while Caleb watched, providing commentary about where things were kept and how the stove tended to burn hot on the left side. She made beans and cornbread, simple fare but filling, and they ate at the table in a silence that was awkward but not hostile. "I usually eat supper around 6, Caleb said, "but we can adjust if that doesn't suit you. 6 is fine. And I take breakfast at dawn. I've got animals to tend to." "I'll have it ready." He looked at her across the table, his blue eyes serious. "Evelyn, you don't have to wait on me hand and foot. That's not what this is." "I know what this is," Evelyn said quietly. "You've given me a home and a name and a future I didn't have yesterday. The least I can do is cook your meals and keep your house clean. That's not why I asked you to marry me. Maybe not, but it's what I can offer in return." She met his gaze steadily. "Let me contribute, Caleb. Let me feel useful. I've spent the last 2 years feeling like a burden, and I can't bear to feel that way anymore." Understanding flickered across his weathered face. "All right, but you tell me if it gets to be too much. We're partners, remember? That means we help each other." Partners. There was that word again, settling into the space between them like a promise. The afternoon passed in quiet industry. Caleb went back to his work, and Evelyn continued organizing the house, making small improvements that helped it feel less like a bachelor's dwelling and more like a home. She found curtains in one of the storage boxes and hung them in the kitchen, found a tablecloth and spread it over the worn wood, arranged the dishes in a way that made more sense. She was kneading dough for tomorrow's bread when Caleb came in, carrying a wooden box. "Found this in the barn," he said, setting it on the table. "Thought you might want it." Evelyn opened the box to find sewing supplies, thread, needles, scissors, buttons, scraps of fabric. "This is wonderful." "It was Catherine's. I couldn't bear to get rid of it, but I haven't had any use for it either." His voice was carefully neutral. "Seems right that it should be used again." Evelyn touched the supplies reverently, thinking about the woman who'd owned them before, the woman whose death had created the silence that still haunted this house. "Thank you for trusting me with them." "Catherine would have liked you," Caleb said abruptly. "She was practical like you, didn't waste time on foolishness." It was perhaps the greatest compliment he could have given her. Evelyn felt her throat tighten. "I hope I can honor her memory by being worthy of this house." "You already are." Caleb cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the emotion of the moment. "I'm going to check the fence line before supper. I'll be back by 6. He left quickly, and Evelyn was alone again with Catherine's sewing box and the growing realization that this marriage, however practical its origins, was going to be more complicated than she'd anticipated. There were ghosts here. Catherine's memory, Thomas's absence, all the lives they'd lived before this moment. They would have to find a way to honor those ghosts while building something new. She made stew for supper, using the vegetables from the root cellar and the dried beef from the pantry. The kitchen filled with good smells, and when Caleb returned at 6 exactly, his face showed appreciation. "Smells like a real home," he said, washing his hands at the basin. They ate together, and this time the silence felt easier. Caleb told her about the fence that needed mending and the cow that might be pregnant. Evelyn told him about finding the sewing box and her plans to make new curtains for the bedrooms. They were small conversations, ordinary and domestic, but they created a rhythm between them. A beginning. After supper, they sat on the porch as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The temperature dropped quickly with the disappearing sun, and Evelyn wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "It is." Caleb was quiet for a moment, then said, "I meant what I told you yesterday, about giving this a month to see if it works. But I want you to know, I'm glad you're here. Whatever happens, I'm glad I'm not spending tonight alone." Now, Evelyn felt something warm bloom in her chest, something that wasn't love yet, but might grow into it given time and care. "I'm glad too." They sat together as the stars emerged, two people who'd been alone too long, learning the shape of companionship. When the cold drove them inside, Caleb banked the fire while Evelyn cleaned the supper dishes. They said goodnight in the hallway, awkward and formal, before retreating to their separate rooms. Evelyn lay in her narrow bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the house settling, of Caleb moving around in his room, of the wind across the desert. This was her life now. This house. This man. This harsh, beautiful landscape. It wasn't what she'd planned or hoped for, but it was real. And it was hers, and that was more than she'd had yesterday. She fell asleep thinking about bread rising and fences mending and all the small, ordinary tasks that would fill her days, and somewhere in the midst of those thoughts, she felt the first stirring of something that might, eventually, become belonging. The first week passed in a careful dance of two people learning each other's rhythms. Evelyn rose before dawn to make coffee and biscuits, standing at the stove in the gray light while Caleb tended the animals. They ate breakfast together without much conversation, both of them still sleep-worn and not yet ready for words. Then he'd disappear into the day's work and she'd turn to the house, finding endless small tasks that needed attention. She discovered that Caleb took his coffee black and strong enough to strip paint, that he was left-handed and favored his right leg when he walked, an old injury he never explained, that he kept his late wife's Bible on the shelf but never opened it, and that he talked to the horses in a low, gentle voice he never used with people. And Caleb learned that Evelyn sang quietly to herself while she worked, old hymns and folk songs from her childhood, that she couldn't abide waste and would find a use for every scrap and leftover, that she slept poorly, often waking in the middle of the night, and that she never mentioned Thomas unless directly asked. They circled each other politely, two strangers trying to inhabit the same space without collision. On the 8th day, Evelyn was beating a rug on the porch when a wagon appeared on the road, raising dust. Caleb was in the barn, and she felt a flutter of uncertainty. Should she call him? Handle it herself? She was still figuring out the rules of this arrangement. The wagon pulled up and Clara Chen climbed down, accompanied by two other women Evelyn didn't recognize. They carried baskets and wore determined expressions that made Evelyn's stomach tighten with apprehension. "Mrs. Moore," Clara called out, and it took Evelyn a moment to realize the name belonged to her now. "We've come to welcome you properly." The other women introduced themselves. Sarah Miller, the doctor's wife, a plump woman with kind eyes and graying blonde hair, and Ruth Dawson, who ran the mercantile with her husband, and had the brisk efficiency of someone who'd spent her life managing details. They swept into the house like a benevolent invasion, setting out food and examining everything with the frank curiosity of women who'd lived in small towns long enough to consider other people's business their own. "Caleb's kept this place too bare," Ruth declared, running a finger along the shelf. "A house needs more than just function." "I've been making small changes," Evelyn said defensively. "We can see that." Sarah smiled warmly. "The curtains are lovely, but we brought a few things we thought you might use." They unpacked their baskets like magicians revealing tricks, a tablecloth embroidered with wildflowers, 2 cushions for the hard wooden chairs, a framed print of a mountain landscape, jars of preserves and pickles, a loaf of fresh bread still warm from the oven, and a small cutting from a rosemary plant wrapped in damp cloth. "For your kitchen garden," Claire explained. "Every house needs herbs." Evelyn felt overwhelmed by the generosity and the intrusion in equal measure. "I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything," Ruth said briskly. "Just accept it. This is how we do things here. Someone new arrives, we help them settle. You do the same for us." They stayed for 2 hours, helping Evelyn arrange the new items, sharing gossip about town, asking careful questions about her life before Redstone that she answered as vaguely as politeness allowed. They were good women, she could tell, genuinely kind beneath their curiosity, but their presence exhausted her, the effort of being gracious and appropriate when all she wanted was to be left alone to find her footing. When they finally left, Evelyn sank into one of the newly cushioned chairs and closed her eyes. The house felt different now, more decorated and less austere, and she wasn't sure how she felt about it. "They mean well," Caleb said from the doorway, making her jump. She hadn't heard him come in. "I know." Evelyn opened her eyes. "It's just a lot." "They'll leave you alone now. This was the official welcome. You've been inspected and approved." There was dry humor in his voice. Ruth probably reported back to half the town before her wagon even made it to the main road. What will she report? Caleb shrugged. That you keep a clean house and seem respectable. That I haven't driven you away yet. That we might actually make a go of this. And will we? The question escaped before Evelyn could stop it. Make a go of this? He was quiet for a long moment, his blue eyes studying her face. I think we might. You're not what I expected. What did you expect? Someone more fragile, I suppose. More defeated. He pulled out the other chair and sat down across from her. But you're stronger than you look. You've taken a bad situation and made something of it. That takes backbone. Evelyn felt heat rise in her cheeks at the unexpected compliment. I'm just doing what needs to be done. That's exactly what I mean. Caleb leaned back in his chair, which creaked under his weight. Most people fall apart when everything goes wrong. You didn't. You kept moving forward. What choice did I have? There's always a choice. You could have given up, could have let despair win. Instead, you married a stranger and moved to a ranch in the middle of nowhere and set about making it work. His expression softened slightly. That's courage, Evelyn. Don't diminish it. She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. They sat in companionable silence until Caleb stood and stretched, his joints popping audibly. I need to ride out to the north pasture tomorrow, he said. Check on the herd. I'll be gone most of the day. Evelyn nodded, already planning her own day. Laundry, baking, mending the shirt she'd noticed had a torn seam, the endless cycle of domestic labor that gave shape to otherwise empty hours. That night, as she lay in bed listening to the coyotes howl in the distance, she thought about what Caleb had said. She'd never considered herself particularly courageous. Courage was for heroes and adventurers, not for widows who'd simply run out of other options. But maybe he was right. Maybe there was a kind of courage in continuing when everything had fallen apart, and building something new from the wreckage of what was lost. The second week brought its first real test. Evelyn woke on Tuesday morning feeling vaguely unwell, her stomach unsettled and her head aching. She ignored it, determined not to be a burden, and went about her morning routine. But as she stood at the stove making breakfast, the room tilted sideways and she had to grip the counter to keep from falling. Evelyn? Caleb's voice came from very far away. She tried to answer, but the words wouldn't form. The floor rushed up to meet her, and then there was nothing. She woke in her bed with no memory of how she'd gotten there. Caleb sat in a chair beside her, his weathered face creased with worry. What happened? Her voice came out scratchy. You fainted. Scared me half to death. He reached for a cup on the bedside table. Doc Walsh is on his way. I sent word with the boy from the Miller place. I don't need a doctor. I'm fine. You collapsed in my kitchen. That's not fine. His tone was firm. Don't argue with me on this. Evelyn was too weak to argue anyway. She lay back against the pillows, feeling embarrassed and frustrated. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. She was supposed to be useful, capable, not a fainting woman who needed tending. Dr. Walsh arrived an hour later, a tall man with gentle hands and a thorough manner. He examined Evelyn while Caleb waited outside, asking questions about her symptoms and her medical history. When he finished, he sat back with a thoughtful expression. When did you last have a proper meal, Mrs. Moore? Evelyn blinked. I eat every day. That's not what I asked. When did you last eat enough? A full meal with meat and vegetables in sufficient quantity? She thought back, trying to remember. The journey west, she'd survived on bread and cheese to save money. Before that, in the weeks after Thomas died and the house was being sold, she'd eaten whatever was cheapest and most filling. And here at the ranch, she'd been so focused on making good meals for Caleb that she'd been giving herself smaller portions, trying to make the supplies last longer. I don't know, she admitted. Dr. Walsh nodded as if this confirmed his suspicions. You're malnourished, Mrs. Moore. Your body is running on empty. That's why you fainted. You need to eat more, and eat better. Regular meals with protein and fat. No more skipping or skimping. But the supplies are sufficient for 2 people eating properly, according to what Caleb told me. The doctor's expression was kind but stern. You're not doing anyone favors by starving yourself. You want to be useful to your husband? Then take care of yourself so you can take care of the household. He left instructions and a tonic. refusing payment despite Evelyn's protests. After he'd gone, Caleb came back into the room carrying a tray loaded with food: eggs, bacon, toast, preserves, and a cup of milk. "Doc says you need to eat." He set the tray on her lap. "So eat." "Caleb, this is too much." "It's exactly enough." He pulled the chair closer to the bed, his expression more serious than she'd seen it. "Why didn't you tell me you were going hungry?" "I wasn't going hungry. I was just being careful." "There's a difference between careful and foolish, and you crossed that line." His voice was rough with something that might have been anger or might have been fear. "We have enough, Evelyn. We're not wealthy, but we're not destitute either. There's no need for you to sacrifice your health." "I didn't want to be a burden," she said quietly. "I didn't want you to regret taking me in." Caleb's expression softened. "Listen to me. You're my wife. That means we share everything: the work, the resources, the challenges. You don't have to earn your keep by starving yourself. You've already earned it by being here, by making this house feel like a home again." Evelyn felt tears prick her eyes. "I don't know how to do this. How to be someone's partner instead of someone's burden." "Neither do I," Caleb admitted. "But we'll figure it out together. That's what partnership means." He gestured to the tray. "Now eat, all of it. And if I catch you skimping on meals again, we're going to have words." She ate slowly, her stomach protesting the sudden abundance, but she forced it down because Caleb sat there watching to make sure she did. When she'd finished, he took the tray and told her to rest. "I have work to do," she protested weakly. "The work will keep. You won't if you don't take care of yourself." He paused in the doorway. "I need you healthy, Evelyn. Not because I need a housekeeper, but because I need my partner. So rest." She slept for most of the day, waking occasionally to find Caleb checking on her or bringing her water or broth. By evening, she felt stronger, though still shaky. He made supper, a simple meal of beans and cornbread that wasn't as good as when she made it, but was filling and warm, and they ate together at the table. "I'm sorry," Evelyn said, "for worrying you." "Don't apologize. Just promise you'll take better care of yourself." "I promise." She hesitated, then added, "Thank you for caring." Caleb's weathered face showed something that might have been tenderness. "We're in this together, remember? That means we look after each other." The incident marked a shift in their relationship. Caleb became more attentive, making sure Evelyn ate proper portions at every meal, insisting she take breaks from her work, treating her less like a convenient housekeeper and more like someone whose well-being mattered to him personally. And Evelyn slowly began to accept his care without feeling like it diminished her worth. They fell into new rhythms. Mornings they worked separately, him with the animals and land, her with the house and garden. But afternoons they often worked together, Caleb teaching Evelyn about the ranch while she taught him about the herbs she was planting, the small improvements she was making. They talked more, sharing stories from their past lives in carefully measured doses, learning each other's histories. Evelyn told him about Thomas, about the children she'd lost, about the slow erosion of hope until all that remained was duty. Caleb told her about Catherine, about the wild joy of their early years and the quiet companionship of their later ones, about the grief that had nearly destroyed him when she died. "I didn't think I'd ever want to share my life with someone again," he admitted one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "It seemed like too much risk, too much potential for pain." "And now?" Evelyn asked. "Now I think maybe the risk is worth it." He glanced at her, his blue eyes warm in the fading light. "You make the silence bearable, Evelyn. You make this house feel lived in instead of haunted." She reached out tentatively and took his hand. His skin was rough and warm, his fingers scarred from years of hard work. He squeezed back gently, and they sat like that until the stars emerged, two people learning to reach for each other instead of retreating into separate solitudes. The third week brought unexpected visitors. Evelyn was in the garden, tending to her herbs and the vegetable seedlings she'd planted, when she heard a wagon approaching. She stood, shading her eyes against the sun, and saw Caleb emerge from the barn. His whole body went stiff, and she knew immediately that something was wrong. A well-dressed couple climbed down from the wagon, a man in his 30s wearing a fine suit and a pretty woman in a traveling dress. The man had Caleb's height and build, though his face was smoother, less weathered by time and hardship. "Hello, Father," he said, his voice carrying across the yard. James, Caleb's son. Evelyn walked slowly toward the house, aware that she was dusty from the garden, her dress old and plain. She felt suddenly conscious of her age, of the unconventional nature of her marriage, of how this must look to Caleb's educated, successful son. "James," Caleb's voice was carefully neutral. "This is unexpected. We were in Tucson on business, thought we'd make the detour to visit." James's eyes found Evelyn. "And you are?" "Evelyn Moore," she said, lifting her chin. "Your father's wife." The silence that followed was deafening. James's face went through several expressions: shock, confusion, something that might have been anger, before settling on polite blankness. His wife, a delicate woman with auburn hair, looked between them with wide eyes. "Wife," James repeated. "When did this happen?" 3 weeks ago," Caleb said. "Evelyn, this is my son James and his wife Margaret." The introductions were stiff and awkward. They moved into the house, where Evelyn hastily put coffee on and arranged the cookies she'd baked that morning on a plate. She was acutely aware of James watching her, assessing her, judging her presence in his dead mother's house. "I would have appreciated being informed," James said to Caleb, his tone clipped. "Instead of arriving to find you've remarried without a word to your only family." "Would it have made a difference?" Caleb asked. "You write twice a year. You visited 3 times in the last decade. I didn't think my personal life was of much interest to you." "That's not fair." "Isn't it?" Caleb's voice was calm, but there was steel underneath. "You've made it clear for years that you have your own life, your own family, your own concerns. I've respected that. Don't act offended now that I've done the same." Evelyn poured coffee with shaking hands, wishing she could disappear. This was a family argument she had no part in, no right to witness. "Mrs. Moore," Margaret said gently, drawing Evelyn's attention, "perhaps you could show me the garden. I'd love to see what you're growing." It was a transparent excuse to give the men privacy, but Evelyn seized it gratefully. They went outside, leaving father and son to their confrontation. "I apologize for James," Margaret said once they were in the garden. "He doesn't handle surprises well. I'm sure this is quite a shock." Evelyn knelt beside her herb garden, grateful for something to do with her hands. A woman his father barely knows, moving into his mother's house. "It's not that." Margaret's voice was thoughtful. "Or not only that, James feels guilty about his father, about leaving him alone all these years. But he doesn't know how to bridge the gap that's grown between them, so he stays away and tells himself it's better that way. And now his father has moved on without needing him, and it stings." Evelyn looked up, studying the younger woman's face. "You seem to understand it clearly. I've spent years watching my husband struggle with his relationship with Caleb. It's one of the great sadnesses of his life." Margaret knelt beside Evelyn, examining the rosemary plant. "Tell me honestly, are you happy here?" The direct question startled Evelyn into honesty. "I'm beginning to be. It's not what I expected, but it's better than what I left behind." "And my father-in-law? Is he good to you?" "He's kind and patient and more generous than I deserve." Margaret smiled. "Then perhaps this isn't the disaster James thinks it is. Perhaps it's exactly what both of you needed." They stayed in the garden for nearly an hour, talking about plants and the weather and carefully avoiding the tension happening inside the house. When they finally returned, they found Caleb and James sitting at the table in tense silence, their coffee untouched. "We should go," James said abruptly, standing. "We need to make Tucson before dark." The goodbyes were stilted and uncomfortable, but as James climbed into the wagon, he turned back to Caleb. "Write to me," he said. "Let me know how you are. Both of you." It wasn't forgiveness or acceptance, but it was something. Caleb nodded once, and they watched the wagon disappear down the road. "I'm sorry," Evelyn said quietly. "I've complicated your relationship with your son." "No." Caleb's voice was firm. "James complicated it himself years ago. You've just forced it into the open." He turned to her, his expression softening. "And Margaret was right. You are what I needed. Don't ever doubt that." That night, as they sat on the porch in their usual evening ritual, Caleb reached for Evelyn's hand without being asked. She gave it freely, and they sat in the darkness holding on to each other, two people who'd found an unexpected anchor in uncertain seas. "The month's almost up," Caleb said. "The trial period we agreed to." Evelyn's heart clenched. "So it is. I don't want you to leave." The words came out rough, honest. "I want you to stay, not because we agreed to try it, but because I can't imagine this house without you anymore." Evelyn felt tears slip down her cheeks. "I don't want to leave either. This feels like home now. You feel like home." Caleb pulled her closer, and she rested her head on his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. They'd come together out of loneliness and desperation, two people with nowhere else to go. But somewhere in the past 3 weeks, in the shared meals and quiet conversations and small acts of care, they'd built something real. "Stay," Caleb whispered. "Stay, and let's see what we can build together." "Yes," Evelyn answered. "Yes, I'll stay." The days after that conversation carried a different quality, as if the air itself had shifted. They'd crossed some invisible threshold, moved from an arrangement of convenience to something that felt like genuine partnership. Evelyn noticed it in small ways, how Caleb lingered at breakfast to talk instead of rushing out to work, how he asked her opinion on ranch decisions, how his hand found hers more easily now when they sat together in the evenings. She noticed it in herself too, in the way she'd stopped thinking of the house as Caleb's place where she happened to live and started thinking of it as theirs. She rearranged the kitchen to suit her workflow without asking permission first. She bought fabric in town and made new curtains for the main room. She planted flowers along the path to the front door, purely for beauty, not because they served any practical purpose. The 4th week brought the first real rain since she'd arrived, a violent thunderstorm that rolled in from the mountains with dramatic fury. Evelyn stood at the window watching lightning split the sky while Caleb secured the barn and brought the horses in from the pasture. He came back to the house soaked through, his silver hair plastered to his head, and she had towels waiting and coffee hot on the stove. "You'll catch your death," she scolded, the words coming out sharper than she'd intended because worry made her voice tight. "I've weathered worse." But he accepted the towel and the coffee gratefully, standing by the stove to warm himself. "The animals are secure. We'll be fine." The storm raged through the afternoon and into the evening, turning the world outside into a chaos of wind and water. Evelyn made stew for supper, and they ate by lamplight, the electricity of the storm seeming to fill the house. When thunder shook the walls, Evelyn jumped despite herself. "You afraid of storms?" Caleb asked. "Not afraid exactly, just respectful." She managed a small smile. "Thomas used to say I was being foolish, that it was just weather. But I've seen what lightning can do to a barn, what wind can do to a roof." Thomas sounds like he wasn't much for acknowledging your feelings. The observation was gentle, but pointed. Evelyn set down her spoon carefully. He was a practical man. He didn't understand fear that couldn't be reasoned away. Fear doesn't work like that. Caleb's blue eyes were steady on hers. Neither does grief or loneliness or any of the other things that matter. Thomas was wrong to dismiss what you felt. Something loosened in Evelyn's chest, a knot she hadn't known was there. "You're the first person who's ever said that." "Then everyone else was wrong too." Caleb reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "Your feelings matter, Evelyn. They mattered then and they matter now." The storm continued through the night, and Evelyn lay in her narrow bed listening to rain hammer the roof, and wondering when exactly she'd started falling in love with Caleb more. It had crept up on her so gradually she hadn't noticed, in the morning coffees and evening conversations, in the way he remembered she preferred her eggs scrambled, and how he'd brought her wildflowers from the pasture last week, without explanation or ceremony, just set them on the table and walked away before she could thank him. She was 63 years old, and she was falling in love, and it terrified her in ways that had nothing to do with thunder and lightning. The morning after the storm dawned clear and brilliant, the desert washed clean and smelling of sage and wet earth. Evelyn was making breakfast when Caleb came in from the barn with news. The creek's flooded, took out part of the fence on the south boundary. He poured himself coffee. "I need to ride down and assess the damage. Maybe start repairs if it's not too bad." "I'll pack you lunch." Evelyn was already moving toward the pantry. Come with me." She turned surprised. "What?" "Come with me," Caleb repeated. "You've been here a month, and you haven't seen the whole property. Time you knew the land you're living on." Evelyn hesitated. She had bread to bake, laundry to hang, a dozen tasks that filled her days and gave them structure. But Caleb was looking at her with an expression that was half invitation and half challenge, and she found herself nodding. They saddled 2 horses, a gentle mare named Daisy for Evelyn, who hadn't ridden in years, and set out across the wet rangeland. The morning sun turned every drop of water into diamonds, and the air was cool and fresh in a way the desert rarely allowed. Evelyn gripped the reins nervously at first, her body remembering the rhythm of riding even as her mind insisted she'd forgotten how. "You're doing fine," Caleb said, riding beside her. "Daisy's patient. She won't let you fall." They rode for nearly an hour, Caleb pointing out landmarks and boundaries, telling her about the land's history and his plans for improving it. The flooded creek was running fast and brown, carrying debris from higher elevations. The fence was indeed damaged, several posts torn out and wire tangled in the rushing water. Caleb dismounted and surveyed the damage with the practiced eye of a man who'd spent decades dealing with nature's unpredictability. "Could be worse. I can fix this in a day or 2 once the water goes down." Evelyn climbed down from Daisy carefully, her legs shaky from the unaccustomed exercise. She walked to the creek bank and looked at the churning water, thinking about how quickly things could change, how solid-seeming structures could be swept away in a single night. "It's beautiful," she said. "Even the destruction has a kind of beauty to it." Caleb came to stand beside her. "That's the desert. It gives and takes in equal measure. You can't control it. You can only learn to work with it." "Like people," Evelyn said softly. "Like people," he agreed. They ate the lunch she'd packed, sitting on a flat rock overlooking the creek, sharing bread and cheese and the last of the preserves Clara had brought. The sun warmed Evelyn's shoulders and the sound of rushing water filled her ears, and she felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, completely at peace. "I've been thinking," Caleb said, breaking the comfortable silence, "about what comes next." Evelyn's heart stuttered. "What do you mean?" "James's visit made me realize something. I've been living day to day for so long I stopped thinking about the future. But now," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "now I want to plan again. To build something that lasts beyond just getting through each day." "What kind of something?" "I want to expand the herd, build a better barn, maybe add a room to the house." He turned to look at her. "I want to make this place not just survivable, but good, a real home, a real ranch, something we can be proud of." Evelyn felt tears prick her eyes at the word "we." "That sounds wonderful." "It'll be hard work and expensive. We'll have to be careful with money, make smart decisions." "I can help with that. I managed Thomas's household finances for years." "I know you can." Caleb's smile was warm. "That's why I'm telling you. This isn't my plan. It's our plan. Our future we're building." They rode back to the house in the afternoon, moving slower now, both of them tired but content. Evelyn's muscles would ache tomorrow, but she didn't care. She felt alive in a way she hadn't in years, connected to the land and the man beside her and the life they were creating together. That evening, as Evelyn was washing dishes after supper, Caleb appeared in the kitchen doorway with something in his hands. "I have something for you," he said, looking oddly uncertain. "I've been working on it in the evenings, in the barn." He held out a wooden box, simple but beautifully made, with her initials carved into the lid. Evelyn dried her hands and took it reverently, running her fingers over the smooth wood. "It's for your sewing things," Caleb said. "I noticed you were keeping them in Catherine's old box, and I thought you should have your own, something that's just yours." Evelyn opened the box to find that he'd fitted the inside with small compartments, perfectly sized for thread and needles and buttons. The craftsmanship was exquisite, every joint tight and true, every surface sanded smooth. "Caleb, this is beautiful." Her voice broke. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," but his weathered face showed pleasure at her reaction. "I wanted you to know that you belong here, that this is your home, not just a place you're living temporarily. Your home, Evelyn." She set the box down carefully and did something she'd never done before. She reached up and kissed him. It was brief and chaste, just a gentle press of lips, but it carried weight beyond its simplicity. Caleb's arms came around her, holding her with a tenderness that made her chest ache. When they pulled apart, they were both smiling. "I love you," Evelyn said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I didn't mean to. I wasn't looking for it. But I do." "I love you too," Caleb said quietly. "Have for weeks now, I think. I just didn't know how to say it." They stood in the kitchen holding each other while the dishes waited and the night settled in around them, two people who'd found love when they'd stopped looking for it, who'd built something real from the wreckage of their separate losses. The fifth week brought change of a different kind. Evelyn woke one morning feeling strange, a tightness in her chest that she tried to ignore. But by afternoon she was coughing, and by evening she had a fever. Caleb put her to bed and sent for Dr. Walsh, his face tight with worry. "It's just a cold," Evelyn protested weakly. "I'll be fine." "You'll be fine because we're taking care of it now," Caleb said firmly. No arguments. Dr. Walsh confirmed it was influenza, not uncommon after the heavy rains, and left instructions for rest and fluids and medication. Caleb nursed her with the same steady patience he brought to all his work, bringing her broth and water, changing the damp cloths on her forehead, sitting beside her bed reading aloud from the newspaper when she was too weak to sleep but too sick to be alone. The fever broke on the third day, leaving Evelyn exhausted but clear-headed. She woke to find Caleb asleep in the chair beside her bed, his head tilted at an uncomfortable angle, his hand resting near hers on the blanket. He looked old in sleep, his 70 years showing in the deep lines of his face and the silver of his hair. But he also looked peaceful, and Evelyn's heart swelled with love for this man who'd taken her in when she had nothing and given her everything. She reached out and touched his hand gently. He woke immediately, blinking in confusion before focusing on her face. "You're awake. How do you feel?" "Better, weak, but better." She squeezed his fingers. "You should be sleeping in your own bed, not sitting vigil like I'm on my deathbed. I wanted to be here in case you needed something." Caleb stretched carefully, grimacing as his back protested. "Besides, I've spent too many nights alone in that bed. I prefer being where you are." "Even when I'm sick and probably contagious?" "Especially then." He stood and poured her water from the pitcher. "When you're well and capable, you don't need me much. But when you're sick, I get to take care of you. I like taking care of you, Evelyn." She accepted the water, sipping slowly. "I like being taken care of. I've spent so long being the one who does the caring, I'd forgotten what it felt like to be cared for." "Get used to it." Caleb's voice was gruff, but his eyes were tender. "We're partners, remember? That means we take turns." Evelyn recovered slowly over the next week, and Caleb refused to let her rush it. He took over the cooking, producing meals that were simpler than what she made, but filling and hot. He did the laundry, hanging it with less precision than she would have, but getting the job done. He brought her books from Clara, who'd heard she was ill and sent over a collection of novels. And every evening he sat with her and talked about his day, about plans for the ranch, about memories from his life before Catherine died. He told her about his childhood in Missouri, about learning to ranch from his father, about the day he'd first seen Catherine at a church social and known immediately he wanted to marry her. "Were you happy?" Evelyn asked. "With Catherine?" "Very happy. She was my best friend." Caleb's expression was wistful, but not pained. "We had a good life together. I'll always be grateful for that." "Do you ever feel guilty for moving on with me?" He considered the question seriously. "No. Catherine wouldn't want me to spend the rest of my life alone, honoring her memory by being miserable. She'd want me to live, to find joy again." He reached for Evelyn's hand. "And I think she'd like you. You're both practical women with kind hearts and no patience for foolishness." "I wish I could have known her." "In a way, you do. Everything good about this house, about this ranch, that's Catherine's legacy. The garden layout, the way the kitchen is organized, the care that went into building something solid. You've built on that foundation, made it your own while respecting what came before." Caleb squeezed her hand. "That's a kind of knowing, I think. Honoring someone's work by continuing it." By the end of the week, Evelyn was well enough to resume light tasks, though Caleb watched her like a hawk and made her rest frequently. They fell back into their routines, but something had deepened between them. The crisis had shown them both how much they'd come to depend on each other, how thoroughly their lives had become intertwined. The sixth week brought a letter from James, addressed to both of them. Caleb read it aloud over breakfast, his voice carefully neutral. James wrote that he and Margaret had talked extensively about their visit, and he wanted to apologize for his reaction. He'd been shocked and perhaps defensive, but he'd had time to reflect and realize that his father deserved happiness and companionship. He invited them both to San Francisco for Christmas, if they were willing to make the journey. He wanted his children to meet their grandfather and step-grandmother. "What do you think?" Caleb asked, setting the letter down. Evelyn thought about it carefully. "I think it's an olive branch, and I think you've missed your son for a long time. It's a difficult journey, especially in winter, and expensive. We could start saving now. Make it a goal." Evelyn reached across the table. "I'd like to meet your grandchildren, Caleb. I'd like to see you and James find your way back to each other." Caleb's eyes were bright with emotion he wouldn't voice. "You'd do that? Travel all that way to meet people who might not welcome you?" "Margaret welcomed me, and James is trying. That's enough to build on." She smiled. "Besides, we're partners. Your family is my family now, for better or worse." "For better," Caleb said firmly. "Definitely for better." They wrote back that evening, accepting the invitation, and Evelyn saw hope in Caleb's face that had been absent before. He talked more about James over the following days, sharing memories and stories, building a bridge across the years of distance. The seventh week brought the first hint of autumn, a coolness in the morning air, and a change in the quality of light. Evelyn's garden was producing well now, and she spent long hours preserving vegetables for winter, filling jars with pickles and relishes and tomato sauce. Caleb worked on improving the barn, and sometimes in the afternoons they worked together, her handing him tools while he explained what he was doing and why. They were working together one afternoon when Ruth Dawson drove up in her wagon, looking agitated. "Evelyn, I need your help," she said without preamble. "Sarah Miller's daughter just had her baby, but Sarah's laid up with a twisted ankle and can't help. The girl's overwhelmed and the husband's useless. I'm organizing the women to take turns bringing meals and helping with the house. Can you take tomorrow?" Evelyn looked at Caleb, who nodded immediately. "Of course. What does she need?" "Everything, cooking, cleaning, someone to hold the baby so she can rest. You'll know what to do once you see the situation." Ruth's expression softened. "You're good at this kind of thing, Evelyn, practical and calm. It would be a real help." The next day, Evelyn rode into town with Caleb and spent the day at the Miller house, which was indeed chaotic. The new mother, a girl barely 20 named Emma, was exhausted and tearful. The baby was colicky, and the young husband looked like he wanted to run away and never come back. Evelyn took charge with the quiet competence of a woman who'd spent her life managing households. She cleaned the kitchen, made a large pot of stew that would last days, showed Emma how to swaddle the baby to ease his crying, and calmly instructed the husband on how to be useful instead of decorative. By the time she left in the late afternoon, the house was clean, the baby was sleeping, Emma was resting, and the husband was following a written list of tasks. Emma grabbed Evelyn's hand as she was leaving. "Thank you," she whispered. "I was starting to think I couldn't do this, that I was a terrible mother." "You're a new mother," Evelyn corrected gently. "There's a difference. You're learning. And that's normal. You're doing better than you think. Will you come back tomorrow, just until I feel steadier?" Evelyn looked at the girl's desperate face and saw herself decades ago, young and overwhelmed and convinced she was failing at the one thing women were supposed to know how to do naturally. "I'll come back," she promised. She ended up going back every day for a week, and then several times a week after that. Other women cycled through as well, Ruth bringing meals, Clara sharing wisdom from her own child-rearing years, Sarah hobbling over on her healing ankle to offer encouragement. But Emma seemed to bond particularly with Evelyn, trusting her calm presence and practical advice. "You're good with her," Caleb observed one evening when Evelyn returned from town tired but satisfied. "You light up when you talk about the baby." "I always wanted children," Evelyn admitted quietly. "Thomas and I tried for years, but my body wouldn't hold them. 3 pregnancies, 3 losses. After the third, the doctor said it was too dangerous to try again." "I'm sorry. That must have been heartbreaking." It was, especially because Thomas, he wanted an heir, a son to carry on his name. When it became clear I couldn't give him that, something changed between us. He never said it outright, but I knew he was disappointed, that I'd failed in my primary purpose. Evelyn's voice was steady but sad. I spent years feeling like I wasn't enough, like I'd broken the unspoken contract of our marriage. Caleb's face darkened with anger. Thomas was a fool. You are enough, Evelyn. You always were. I know that now. But it took a long time to believe it. She managed a small smile. Helping Emma, seeing her baby thrive, it's healing something in me I didn't know still needed healing. Then keep doing it as much as you want. Caleb pulled her close. We'll work around it. This ranch can spare you when someone needs you more. The 8th week brought the first frost, a delicate lacework of ice on the windows and garden. Evelyn mourned her tender plants, but celebrated the hardier ones that survived. She made plans for a bigger garden next spring, sketching layouts and ordering seeds from the mercantile catalog. She and Caleb had moved into an easy rhythm of domesticity and affection. He'd built her a writing desk in the corner of the main room so she could manage their accounts and correspondence. She'd learned to help with some of the lighter ranch work, feeding chickens and collecting eggs, even learning to milk the cow with Caleb's patient instruction. And at night they sat together on the porch even as the weather cooled, wrapped in blankets in each other's company, talking or silent as the mood struck them. Sometimes Caleb would share memories of Catherine, and Evelyn would share memories of Thomas, and they'd honor their past lives while building their present one. One evening, Caleb surprised her by standing and offering his hand. "Dance with me," he said. "There's no music. There's wind in the sage and coyotes singing. That's music enough." His eyes were warm. "Dance with me, Evelyn." She let him pull her up, and they swayed together on the porch, moving slowly to a rhythm only they could hear. Caleb held her carefully, as if she were precious, and Evelyn rested her head on his chest and listened to his heartbeat and thought about how strange and wonderful life could be. "I'm happy," she said, surprised by the truth of it. "I didn't think I could be again, but I am." "So am I." Caleb's arms tightened around her. "You gave me my life back, Evelyn. Before you came, I was just existing, waiting to die. Now I'm living again, planning again, hoping again." "We gave each other our lives back," Evelyn corrected. "That's what partners do." They danced until the cold drove them inside, and then they sat by the fire drinking tea and making plans for Christmas in San Francisco, for improvements to the ranch, for all the ordinary and extraordinary tomorrows stretching out before them. Two people who'd reached the end of their roads and found, waiting there, the beginning of something new. Winter came to the Arizona desert with surprising gentleness, bringing cool mornings and mild afternoons that made working outdoors a pleasure rather than an endurance test. Evelyn spent hours in preparation for the journey to San Francisco, sewing new clothes for both herself and Caleb, setting aside money from their careful budget, arranging with Ruth and Clara to check on the ranch while they were gone. The trip itself loomed large in her imagination, the longest journey she'd take since coming west, but this time with purpose and companionship rather than desperation. She was nervous about meeting James's children, about being in a city after months of desert solitude, about whether she'd measure up to whatever expectations existed for Caleb's new wife. "You're worrying again," Caleb said one evening, watching her fidget with her sewing. "I just want them to like me." "They will. And if they don't, that's their loss, not yours." He set down the harness he'd been mending. "Evelyn, you've made my life immeasurably better. You've brought light and warmth and purpose back to this house. Anyone with eyes can see that. James will see it too. What if he thinks I'm trying to replace his mother? Then I'll remind him that you're not replacing anyone. You're adding to what we had, building on it. Catherine will always be James's mother. You're something different. My partner, my companion, my love. There's room in this family for both truths." The words settled Evelyn's anxiety somewhat, though she still found herself mentally rehearsing conversations and planning how to present herself. She wanted to honor what Caleb had with Catherine while also claiming her rightful place in his present life. It was a delicate balance, and she wasn't entirely sure how to strike it. December arrived with unexpected rain, a 3-day storm that turned the desert green and filled the creek to overflowing. Caleb worked from dawn to dusk, securing everything against the weather, and Evelyn kept hot food and dry clothes ready for him. On the third evening, he came in soaked and exhausted, and she had him sit by the fire while she heated water for a bath. "I'm too old for this," he muttered, rubbing his shoulder where an old injury ached in the damp. "You're not old, you're experienced," Evelyn corrected, kneeling behind him to massage the tight muscles. "There's a difference." He groaned as her fingers found a particularly knotted spot. "Where did you learn to do this?" Thomas's back troubled him in his later years. "I had to learn." Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, working out the tension. "Though I have to say, you complain less than he did. Catherine used to say I was too stubborn to admit when I was hurting. She was right." Evelyn's tone was fond. "But I'm learning to read you anyway. The way you favor your left side when you're tired, how you rub your shoulder when it's bothering you, the set of your jaw when you're in pain but won't say so." Caleb reached back and caught her hand, bringing it to his lips. "You pay attention." "Of course I do. I love you." The words came easily now, natural as breathing. They'd said them dozens of times since that first confession in the kitchen, but each time carried the same gentle weight, the same quiet truth. The bath helped, and so did Evelyn's ministrations, and by the time they went to bed, still in separate rooms, though Evelyn suspected that might change eventually, Caleb was moving more easily. But the incident reminded them both that they weren't young anymore, that their bodies were accumulating the wear of decades, that time was precious and not to be wasted. A week before they were scheduled to leave for San Francisco, Emma's husband came to the ranch looking panicked. "Mrs. Moore, Emma's asking for you. The baby's sick, and she's beside herself with worry, and Dr. Walsh is out of town tending to someone who broke a leg." Evelyn was in the wagon before he'd finished speaking, Caleb driving them into Redstone at a pace that had the horses snorting in protest. They found Emma pacing with the baby, who was flushed with fever and crying weakly. Evelyn took charge immediately, her years of nursing Thomas and her natural competence rising to the surface. She examined the baby carefully. He had a fever but was still nursing, still producing tears, no signs of the serious illnesses that could take infants so quickly. She showed Emma how to bring the fever down with cool cloths, how to keep him hydrated. What signs to watch for that would require a doctor. She stayed through the night, Caleb dozing in a chair in the parlor while Evelyn walked the baby and monitored his condition. By morning, the fever had broken and the baby was sleeping peacefully. Emma, exhausted and grateful, clung to Evelyn's hand. "I don't know what I would have done without you. You saved him." "He was never in serious danger," Evelyn said gently. "But I understand the fear. When someone you love is sick and small and helpless, it feels like the world is ending. You must have been a wonderful mother." The words hit Evelyn like a physical blow, unexpected and sharp. She'd never been a mother, not successfully, but she'd wanted to be, and she'd lost that chance, and hearing Emma say those words created an ache that was both painful and somehow healing. "I would have liked to be," she said quietly, "but it wasn't meant to be. So instead I try to help where I can." Emma squeezed her hand. "You help more than you know. You make me feel like I can do this, like I'm not alone." As they drove back to the ranch in the early morning light, Caleb reached over and took Evelyn's hand. "You were magnificent," he said. "Calm and capable and exactly what they needed. I just did what anyone would do." "No. You did what you do, step in, assess the situation, and make it better. It's a gift, Evelyn, the way you care for people." She thought about that as they rode home, about the different ways a life could matter. She hadn't been a mother, hadn't raised children of her own, but she'd cared for Thomas through his final illness, helped Margaret in her own way despite their distance, and now she was helping Emma navigate early motherhood. Perhaps that counted for something. Perhaps there were many ways to nurture, and none of them less valuable than the others. The journey to San Francisco began on a cold December morning, with Caleb and Evelyn boarding the train in Tucson with their carefully packed bags and nervous excitement. Evelyn had never been on a train before, and she gripped Caleb's hand as the engine lurched into motion, carrying them north through landscapes that shifted from desert to mountains to valleys. They shared a sleeping compartment, And that first night, as the train rocked through the darkness, Caleb asked quietly, "Would you like me to sleep on the floor? Give you privacy?" Evelyn considered the narrow beds, the small space, the fact that they'd been married for 3 months and still maintained separate rooms. She thought about how much she trusted this man, how safe she felt with him, how tired she was of sleeping alone. "No," she said. "Stay. We're married. It's time we acted like it." They shared a bed for the first time that night, lying close in the darkness, fully clothed and chaste but together. Caleb held her carefully, and Evelyn rested her head on his shoulder and felt something settle into place. This was right. This was what marriage should be, not duty or performance, but genuine companionship and affection. "I love you," Caleb whispered into her hair. "I love you too," she whispered back. They arrived in San Francisco to find James and Margaret waiting at the station with 2 children, a boy of 8 and a girl of 6, both dressed in their Sunday best and looking at their grandfather with curiosity. James's expression was guarded but not hostile, and Margaret's smile was genuinely warm. "Father," James said, extending his hand. "Mrs. Moore." "Evelyn, please," she said, shaking his hand firmly. "We're family now." The children broke the initial awkwardness, the boy asking Caleb endless questions about the ranch while the girl attached herself to Evelyn's skirt, fascinated by her grandmother's simple dress and practical manner. They drove through the city to James's house, a beautiful Victorian painted in cheerful colors, and Evelyn felt overwhelmed by the noise and bustle and sheer number of people after months in the desert solitude. The visit was both wonderful and challenging. James's house was elegant and well-appointed, a stark contrast to the simple ranch. Evelyn felt out of place initially, conscious of her age and her plain clothes and her lack of sophistication. But Margaret was kind, including her in conversations and making her feel valued, and the children were delightful, full of questions about desert animals and ranch life. Caleb and James had several long conversations, working through years of distance and misunderstanding. Evelyn watched them carefully navigate their relationship, saw James's guilt and Caleb's carefully guarded hope, and did her best to facilitate without interfering. She told James stories about his father, how hard Caleb worked, how kind he was, how he'd saved her when she had nowhere else to go. "He's different with you," James said one afternoon when they were alone. "Lighter, somehow, more engaged with life." "He was lonely for a long time," Evelyn said carefully. "We both were. We helped each other find our way back. I should have been there for him. After Mother died, I should have stayed. You were young and had your own life to build. Caleb doesn't blame you for that. Maybe he should." James's expression was pained. "I abandoned him when he needed me most." "Then don't abandon him now." Evelyn's voice was gentle but firm. "You can't change the past, but you can shape the future. Write to him. Visit when you can. Let your children know their grandfather. That's what he needs from you now." On Christmas morning, they gathered around the tree with the children shrieking in delight over their presents. Evelyn had made rag dolls for the girl and whittled animals for the boy, simple gifts that couldn't compete with the expensive toys James and Margaret provided. But the children treasured them anyway, the girl naming her doll immediately and the boy arranging his wooden horses and cows in careful formations. James gave Caleb a photograph of the family, himself, Margaret, and the children, framed in silver. Caleb's hands shook slightly as he accepted it. "For your mantle," James said, "so you remember us when you're back home." "I could never forget you," Caleb said, his voice rough. "You're my son." They embraced then, awkwardly at first, and then with genuine warmth, and Evelyn felt tears slip down her cheeks watching 2 men who loved each other finally bridge the gap that had separated them. Margaret gave Evelyn a beautiful shawl, soft wool in deep blue, that must have cost more than Evelyn spent on clothes in a year. "For the cold desert nights," she said, "and because you've made our family whole again." The journey home felt different from the journey out. They were both tired but satisfied, carrying with them the photograph and the shawl, and the knowledge that they'd accomplished something important. James had promised to visit in the spring, to bring the children to see the ranch, to stay connected. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation, but it was real and honest and enough to build on. "Thank you," Caleb said as the train carried them south. for helping me and James find our way back to each other. You did that yourselves. I just facilitated. You did more than that. You showed him that I was happy, that I'd built a good life. That gave him permission to stop feeling guilty and start feeling glad. Caleb kissed her forehead. You're a gift, Evelyn Moore, the best gift I could have asked for. They returned to the ranch to find everything in good order, Clara and Ruth having kept their promise to watch over things. The desert winter had deepened in their absence, and Evelyn was surprised by how glad she was to be home. San Francisco had been exciting and beautiful, but this harsh, simple place felt like where she belonged. The new year arrived with quiet celebration, just the two of them sharing a simple meal and watching the stars emerge. Evelyn thought about the year behind them, the desperation and fear that had driven her to Redstone, the practical arrangement that had become genuine love, the slow building of a life she hadn't known she wanted, but now couldn't imagine living without. What are you thinking? Caleb asked. That a year ago I couldn't have imagined this. Being happy, being loved, having a future to look forward to. She leaned against him. I thought my life was over, that I'd lost everything and would just survive until I died. And now? Now I feel like I'm finally living, not just surviving or enduring, but actually living, building something that matters. She turned to look at him. Thank you for seeing me that day by the water trough, for offering me a chance when I'd run out of chances. Thank you for taking it, for trusting me when you had no reason to. Caleb's arms tightened around her, for making this house feel like a home again. The years that followed were good ones, marked by small joys and ordinary challenges. They expanded the garden, added chickens and a few more cattle, made improvements to the house. Emma's baby grew strong and healthy, and Evelyn became a fixture in the young family's life, a surrogate grandmother who was called upon for advice and comfort and celebration. James and Margaret visited twice a year, bringing the children who loved the ranch and their grandfather with equal enthusiasm. The distance between father and son never fully closed, but it narrowed enough that they could speak honestly and show affection, and that was more than either had hoped for. Caleb's health declined slowly over the years, his old injuries catching up with him, but he remained active and engaged, refusing to let age defeat him. Evelyn tended him with the same care she'd given Thomas, but with more love and less duty. When he needed help with tasks he'd once done alone, she was there without making him feel diminished. When pain kept him awake at night, she sat with him and held his hand and reminded him that he wasn't alone. They celebrated their 5th anniversary with a quiet dinner on the porch, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and purple. Caleb had given her a necklace, simple silver with a small turquoise stone, and she'd made him a new shirt from fabric she'd saved for months to afford. Do you ever regret it? He asked. Marrying me instead of finding some other option? There was no other option, and even if there had been, I would have chosen you. Evelyn's voice was certain. You gave me back my life, Caleb. My purpose, my joy. I could never regret that. You did the same for me. I was just existing before you came. Now I'm living. They made love that night for the first time in months, his body willing but weakened, her touch gentle and patient. It wasn't the passion of youth, but something deeper, tenderness and gratitude, and the knowledge that their time was precious and finite. Afterward, they lay entwined in the darkness, listening to each other breathe, grateful for every moment. The end came on a warm spring morning, 5 years after they'd married. Caleb had been slowing down for weeks, his energy flagging, but he'd insisted on doing his usual rounds of the property. Evelyn had gone with him, worried, but respecting his need for independence. They'd sat together by the creek, now familiar and well-loved, watching the water flow over stones. Caleb had talked about the ranch, about improvements he wanted to make, about James's upcoming visit. Then he'd simply closed his eyes and stopped breathing, peaceful and without pain, slipping away as quietly as he'd lived. Evelyn held him for a long time, there by the creek in the warm sunshine, feeling the life leave his body and knowing that a chapter of her own life was ending too. She grieved, but not with the desperate, empty grief she'd felt for Thomas. This grief was clean and honest, mourning the loss of someone deeply loved while being grateful for the years they'd shared. The funeral was well attended, the townspeople turning out to honor a man who'd been quiet but respected, who'd lived with integrity and died at peace. James came with his family, and he and Evelyn stood together by the grave, supporting each other through the service. "Will you stay at the ranch?" James asked afterward. "Yes." Evelyn's voice was firm. "This is my home. Your father and I built this life together, and I'll honor it by continuing what we started. I could help, financially, if you need it. I'll be all right. Your father made sure of that." Caleb had revised his will shortly after they married, leaving everything to Evelyn with the provision that it would pass to James after her death. "But I appreciate the offer, and I hope you'll visit. Bring the children. This ranch is their heritage too." She lived on alone at the ranch, maintaining it with the help of hired hands, continuing the work she and Caleb had begun. Emma's family visited regularly, the baby now a boisterous toddler who called her Grandma Evelyn. Clara and Ruth checked on her weekly, and the women of Redstone made sure she wasn't isolated or forgotten. At 68 years old, Evelyn Hart Moore sat on her porch each evening watching the sunset, wrapped in the blue shawl Margaret had given her all those years ago. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the desperation and fear, the unlikely proposal, the slow building of love from practical beginnings. She thought about Thomas and the life that had been, and Caleb and the life that had been better than she'd dreamed possible. She had no regrets. When she'd stepped off that stagecoach with $17 and nowhere to go, she'd thought her life was ending. Instead, it had been beginning. The years with Caleb had been the best of her life, not because they were easy or romantic or anything like the stories young people told, but because they were real and honest and built on genuine partnership. She'd arrived in Redstone with nothing and found everything: a home, a purpose, a love that had come late but complete. She'd learned that it was never too late to begin again, that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the choice to move forward despite it, that the best things in life often came wrapped in the most unexpected packages. As the stars emerged one by one in the desert sky, Evelyn smiled and raised her cup of tea in a silent toast to second chances and unlikely love stories, to partnerships built on honesty rather than illusion, to the truth that sometimes when you reach the end of every road you know, life offers you one more path, unexpected, challenging, and absolutely worth taking. She'd walked that path with Caleb, and though he was gone now, the journey had transformed her in ways that would last the rest of her days. She was no longer the desperate widow who'd arrived with nothing. She was Evelyn Moore, rancher, friend, surrogate grandmother, and survivor. She was a woman who'd been offered an impossible choice at the worst moment of her life and had found the courage to say yes. And that, she thought as the desert night settled around her and peace filled her heart, had made all the difference.